March 24, 1945. Aschaffenburg, Germany. American soldiers from the 45th Infantry Division stood at the edge of a medieval town on the banks of the Main River, expecting another quick surrender. The war was ending. Berlin was burning. German resistance was collapsing everywhere. This should have been easy. But as the first patrol moved into the cobblestone streets, they stopped. Above them, hanging from lampposts along the main square, were bodies. German civilians. Men in civilian clothes. Women still clutching white flags. Their necks broken. Their faces purple. Signs pinned to their chests read, "Traitor" and "Coward" in jagged German script. The Americans stood in silence, rifles lowering slightly, trying to understand what they were seeing. Then the shooting started. The commander of Aschaffenburg was a man named Emil Lambert. He was not a general. He was not even a colonel. He was a major in the Wehrmacht, a career officer who had survived the Eastern Front and come home to die with honor. He had been ordered to hold the city for 48 hours to cover the retreat of German forces across the Rhine. He decided he would hold it forever. Lambert was a true believer. Not in strategy. Not in tactics. In the myth. The myth that Germany could still win. That one man, in one city, could turn the tide. That if he refused to bend, the enemy would break. He looked at the medieval walls, the stone castle overlooking the river, the narrow streets that twisted like veins through the old town, and he saw Stalingrad. He saw a fortress. He saw his name in history. But Aschaffenburg was not a military city. It had no garrison, no fortifications, no ammunition depots or tank battalions. It had 12,000 civilians, a handful of old men with hunting rifles, and a few hundred exhausted soldiers from broken units retreating west. Lambert didn't care. He declared the city a fortress. He armed every male over 15. He distributed weapons to the Hitler Youth. He ordered the women to dig trenches and barricade the streets. And when the mayor came to him, begging him to spare the city, to let the Americans pass, Lambert had him arrested. The mayor was hung from a lamppost in the town square at dawn. His crime was requesting surrender. The American Third Army had been racing across Germany for weeks. Town after town had fallen without a fight. White flags appeared in windows. Soldiers walked out with their hands up. Civilians cheered in the streets, relieved the war was over. Aschaffenburg should have been the same. It sat on a key crossing of the Main River, a medieval town with a Baroque castle and winding streets built for carriages, not tanks. The 45th Infantry Division rolled toward it with confidence. They expected token resistance. A few shots. Maybe a roadblock. Then surrender. They had no idea what Lambert had turned the city into. The first American unit to enter the outskirts was a rifle company from the 157th Infantry Regiment. They moved cautiously through the outer neighborhoods, scanning windows, checking doorways. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. No civilians. No movement. Just silence and the smell of smoke. Then a woman stepped into the street. She was middle-aged, wearing a floral dress, her hands raised above her head. She was crying. The Americans lowered their rifles slightly, motioning her forward. She took 2 steps. Then she pulled a grenade from under her dress and threw it. The explosion killed 2 soldiers instantly. The woman was shot before the smoke cleared. She died in the street, her body twisted, the pin still in her hand. The soldiers stared at her, trying to process what had just happened. Then the windows erupted. Gunfire poured from every building. Rifles. Machine guns. Panzerfausts screaming from second-story windows. The Americans dove for cover, scrambling behind walls and vehicles as the ambush unfolded. They returned fire, suppressing windows, lobbing grenades into doorways. When they finally pushed forward and cleared the first building, they found 3 bodies inside. An old man with a Mauser, a teenage boy with a Panzerfaust, and a 12-year-old girl reloading a machine gun. The girl was still alive when they found her. She refused to speak. She just stared at them with cold, empty eyes. One of the medics tried to treat her wounds. She spat in his face. She died an hour later. The soldiers didn't talk about it. They just moved to the next street. The pattern repeated itself block by block. Women and children used as combatants. Ambushes from cellars and attics. Booby traps in doorways. Snipers firing from church towers. The Americans advanced slowly, clearing each building with grenades and rifle fire, taking casualties from defenders who had no training and no chance but fought anyway because Lambert had told them to. By the second day, the 45th Infantry Division had pushed into the heart of the old town, but progress was brutal. Every street was contested. Every building was a fortress. The medieval layout worked against them. Tanks couldn't maneuver. Artillery couldn't see targets. The stone walls absorbed bullets like sponges. And the Germans kept fighting. The American commander, Major General Robert Frederick, stood in a command post on the edge of the city and studied the maps. His division was bleeding. Casualties were mounting. The advance had stalled. And every hour they wasted here was an hour the Germans used to regroup elsewhere. He looked at the intelligence reports. Civilians forced to fight. Executions in the streets. Women and children used as shields. Then he looked at the artillery officer standing beside him and said 6 words that would define the battle. Level it. All of it. No exceptions. The artillery barrage began at dawn on March 26. 155mm long Tom howitzers, positioned on the hills overlooking the city, opened fire in sequence. The shells screamed overhead, a sound like freight trains tearing through the sky, and slammed into the old town with precision. The first volley hit the town square. The second hit the church. The third hit the medieval guild halls along the river. The barrage did not stop. For 6 hours, American artillery pounded Aschaffenburg with methodical brutality. They targeted the castle, the bridges, the barracks, the administrative buildings. But they also targeted the residential blocks, the narrow streets, the stone houses where snipers hid. The bombardment was not surgical. It was erasure. The sound was apocalyptic. A rolling thunder that never stopped. Inside the city, the defenders huddled in cellars and basements, covering their ears as the world came apart above them. The stone buildings that had stood for centuries cracked and collapsed. Roofs caved in. Walls toppled into the streets. Fires spread through the rubble, fed by broken gas lines and splintered timber. The civilians who had been forced to fight now cowered in the dark, praying the next shell would miss. Some did. Most didn't. By the time the barrage lifted, entire neighborhoods had been reduced to smoking craters. The old town, with its medieval charm and Baroque facades, was gone. What remained was a skeletal wasteland of shattered stone and burning timber. The infantry moved in behind the guns. They advanced through streets that no longer existed, climbing over rubble piles and collapsed walls, firing at shadows. Resistance had not stopped. It had become desperate. German soldiers and armed civilians fired from the ruins, using the destruction as cover, but they were isolated now. Cut off. Running out of ammunition. The Americans cleared building by building, room by room, sometimes fighting hand-to-hand in the smoke and dust. They found bodies everywhere. Soldiers. Civilians. Children. Some killed by artillery. Some executed by Lambert's men for trying to flee. The smell was unbearable. Cordite and smoke and death mixed into a stench that clung to their uniforms and stayed in their lungs for days. By March 28th, only one position remained. Schloss Johannesburg, the massive Renaissance castle that sat on a hill overlooking the river. It was a fortress within a fortress. Thick stone walls. Narrow windows. A commanding view of the entire city. Lambert had retreated there with the last of his men. About 150 soldiers and a handful of Hitler youth. They had ammunition. They had water. They had nowhere to go. The Americans surrounded the castle and called for surrender. Lambert refused. He sent a message back through a captured civilian. "We will die here. Come and take it." The Americans did not assault the castle. They brought up the long toms again. For 2 days, they hammered the fortress with high-explosive shells, targeting the walls, the towers, the gates. The castle had survived wars for 400 years. It had weathered sieges and revolutions and occupations. But it could not survive American artillery. The walls cracked. The towers collapsed. The courtyard filled with rubble and smoke. Inside, the defenders ran out of options. The artillery had cut them off from water. The rubble blocked the exits. The air was thick with dust and the smell of explosives. Men began to break. Some tried to surrender and were shot by Lambert's officers. Some killed themselves. On March 30th, a white flag appeared in one of the shattered windows. The Americans stopped firing. Silence fell over the ruins. Slowly, cautiously, the castle gates opened. German soldiers stumbled out, hands raised, faces black with soot and blood. They were exhausted. Starving. Some were crying. Behind them came the civilians. Women and children who had been trapped inside for days, blinking in the daylight like prisoners freed from a cave. And then, at the rear of the column, came Emil Lambert. He was still in uniform, still carrying his sidearm. He walked with his back straight, his face blank, as if nothing had happened. As if he had won. The American soldiers who took his surrender did not speak to him. They disarmed him in silence, searched him, and led him to a holding area where other prisoners sat on the ground under guard. Lambert sat among them, staring at nothing. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply waited. The war would end in 5 weeks. Berlin would fall. Hitler would die. And Lambert would stand trial for what he had done in Aschaffenburg. He would be convicted of war crimes. The execution of civilians. The illegal use of non-combatants in combat. The willful destruction of his own city. He would be sentenced to death. The sentence would later be commuted to life imprisonment. He would die in prison in 1962, still believing he had done the right thing. The city of Aschaffenburg was left in ruins. 70% of the old town was destroyed. Hundreds of civilians were dead. The medieval architecture was gone. The castle was a shell. The bridges were rubble. The streets were impassable. It would take decades to rebuild. The American 45th Infantry Division moved on within days, pushing deeper into Germany, leaving the destroyed city behind them. In their after-action reports, they recorded 311 American casualties during the battle. German losses were estimated at over 2,000, most of them civilians forced to fight. The reports were filed. The division moved east. The war continued. But Aschaffenburg became a lesson, a reminder of what happens when fanaticism meets overwhelming force, of what happens when a commander decides to sacrifice a city for pride, of what happens when civilians are turned into soldiers and soldiers are turned into executioners. The American response was not about strategy. It was not about tactics. It was about sending a message that resistance was futile, that atrocities would be met with fire, that the war was over, and anyone who refused to accept that would be erased. General Patton himself reviewed the reports from Aschaffenburg and made a note in his diary. Lambert was a fool. He killed his own people for nothing. We gave him what he wanted. We gave him his war. And we buried him in it. The ruins of Aschaffenburg still stand today. The castle has been rebuilt. The old town has been reconstructed. The lampposts where the civilians were hanged are gone. But the memory remains. In the city archives. In the scarred walls of the surviving buildings. In the stories passed down through generations. The people of Aschaffenburg remember what Lambert did. They remember the hanging bodies. The forced conscription. The children with rifles. And they remember what came after. The barrage that lasted 6 hours. The fires that burned for days. The American soldiers who walked through the rubble with cold, hard faces and did not stop until every last defender was silenced. It was not a battle. It was an execution. And it was designed to be.